Once upon a time, there were three little engines that lived in their own little shed on their own little railway. Their names were Duke, Stuart and Falcon. And Stanley. Oh, and a whole load of other engines that we never see in the books. The Reverend W. Awdry was a railway modeller as well as an author, and on his mid-Sodor railway layout were a whole load of engines that never appeared in the books. I've decided to take it upon myself to draw these engines over the course of several videos, so join me as I bring these engines to life. The three engines I'll be covering in this video all use the same type of model, the Gem Vari Kit. This was a freelance design with no direct basis. I suppose I could have simply found an engine that most closely resembles the Vari Kit and based these three engines on that design, but I'm sure you'll forgive me for thinking that that would make for a rather boring video. So I've gone for three wildly different engine classes to base Albert, Jim and Tim on. Rather than replicate the style of C. Reginald Dalby as I've done for the last few videos, I've decided to go for a style more reminiscent of Gunvor and Peter Edwards illustrations to evoke a similar vibe to the artwork from Duke the Lost Engine. This style is a lot harder to replicate, but I think I've managed reasonably well. Albert here is based on an engine from France, more specifically a Corpay Louvet 060T, or 030T, since the French locomotive classification counts axles rather than wheels. I discovered this class of engine about a year or two ago and kind of fell in love with them. The proportions are just really pleasing in my opinion. I am cheating a little here, since these engines were generally built to meter gauge, over a foot wider than the mid-Sodor Railway's 2 foot 3 inches. Having said that, this type of engine was a stock design that Corpay Louvet supplied to a number of railways, so I suppose it's not out of the realm of possibility that they could have built engines to a similar design for other gauges. As well as meter gauge, France had a number of 600mm gauge railways, primarily for industrial use, and an engine of that gauge is probably more feasible to re-gauge to 2 foot 3. I've made some modifications here and there to the design to make it look a little more like the model, such as side plates and coal bunkers in front of the cab. Awdry's model layout for the mid-Sodor Railway adhered to a timetable, and Albert's main responsibility was pulling the Parliamentary, or the Parley, a train of four-wheel third-class coaches which stopped at every station. However, I like to think that Albert is sometimes allowed to take the boat train, which Falcon isn't terribly happy about. I like to think of Albert and Falcon as rivals, often trying to outdo each other. They're both quite brash and overconfident, but whereas Falcon is uptight and pompous, Albert is a bit more suave and laid back, which often makes him look like the more reasonable engine, even when he's in the wrong. In this scene I'm drawing, it looks like Albert has managed to call dibs on the boat train before Falcon can get the chance. "What do you think you're doing?" cried Falcon. "That's my boat train." "Well," replied Albert, "you needn't worry about not having a train to pull. The parliamentary coaches are waiting for you in the carriage shed." I've got some story ideas for Albert and Falcon. Hopefully I can share them at some point. With all that said, here is the completed illustration. When coming up with a basis for Jim, I'd initially considered drawing him as a Kerr Stewart Skylark class. I still think this class of engine is a decent fit for Jim, especially since one of the Mid-Sodor Railway's inspirations, the Snail Beach District Railways, had a Skylark as part of their locomotive fleet, alongside a pair of Baldwin 1012Ds like Stanley, and a Falcon 042 saddle tank like, well, Falcon. However, I ultimately decided not to go with the Skylark for a number of reasons. Firstly, basing Jim on a Skylark is something that a lot of fans have already done, and I wanted to put a more unique spin on the engine. Secondly, is that the original model of Jim doesn't really look anything like a Skylark. He's an 060 tank with small coal bunkers in front of the cab, versus the Skylarks which are 042 tanks with rear coal bunkers. So, in the end, I decided to base Jim on a Bagnall Type E 060 tank. As previously mentioned, the Gem Vari kit isn't based on anything specific, but I think the Bagnall looks similar enough to Jim and the dates line up as well, given that these engines were built throughout the early 20th century. A fun or not so fun fact about the Bagnall Type E is that one of them was nearly preserved by the Talyllyn Railway. The Harts Hill Granite Quarry had an example named Stafford, and in 1954 the TR Preservation Society had got wind of this engine's existence. They needed a new engine and wanted to buy Stafford, but ultimately the engine was cut up before they got the chance to do so. The way I see it, Jim is one of the Mid-Sodor's youngest engines, but is a bit of an old soul, not brash like Falcon and Albert and not as excitable as Stewart. He just likes to take things slowly and carefully, watching the world go by as he trundles up and down the line with his slow goods train. Sometimes when the other young engines are acting up, Duke will point to Jim as an example. "Why can't you be more like Jim? You never see him getting into trouble." Jim's good service was known as the horse and cart due to how slow it was. I've decided to draw Jim alongside an actual horse and cart. Perhaps they're competing in the world's most leisurely race. I loosely based this scene on a photo taken of the Glyn Valley Tramway, although I flipped the orientation, mainly so that the blocking wasn't too similar to that one illustration of Sir Handel from Home at Last. Drawing horses is always a bit of a daunting task for me, but I think he turned out pretty well in the end. And so, here is the finished drawing. Awdry's model of Tim has his wheels covered with side plates, which influenced my decision regarding what to base him on. Now truthfully, I could have just grabbed any old narrow gauge engine and stuck some tram skirts on them, but I figured it would be more interesting to base Tim on an engine which had them fitted in real life. One notable example of such an engine is the type that worked on the Glyn Valley Tramway, built by Bayer Peacock and Company. However, I wasn't too comfortable with basing Tim on one of these for one simple reason: the Pico Dennis kit. To put it simply, I think if there was a chance that Tim was a Glyn Valley Tramway design, then his model would have been based on a Pico Dennis and not a Gem Vari kit. Tim's model bears a closer resemblance to the Sharp Stewart 042 tram locomotives used on the Clocker Valley Railway in Northern Ireland. It's true that Tim's model is an 060, but since he has side plates, I suppose the wheel arrangement doesn't really matter. Similar to the Midland Railway flat iron, the Clocker Valley Railway Sharpies are another class of engine I have a bit of history with. If you're familiar with my artwork outside of YouTube, then you might recognise Red Current, an original character of mine that I've drawn a number of times over the years, both with and without a face. Going even further back, I even made several trains models of Red Current, although these have sadly been lost to time. Going back to Tim, I've given him some differences from the CVR Sharpies to bring his design a little closer to that of the model. Most notably, the dome is further forward and the front cab windows are round, and his tram skirts also cover up his front as well as the sides. I've drawn him pulling into Casnahawen. Quite possibly this is a workman's train, in which case the smartly dressed couple at the station probably won't be boarding it. I think of Tim as being a bit of an introvert in comparison to the majority of fairly extroverted engines on the mid-Sodor. He mainly works off the beaten track, and doesn't bed down at Arlesdale sheds like most of the other engines. I like to think that he gets on quite well with Jim, and given that Tim is quite an old engine whereas Jim is fairly young, perhaps Tim is something of a mentor or father figure to Jim in much the same way that Duke is to Stuart and Falcon. And here is the finished illustration. And so, that was 3 of the mystery mid-Sodor engines according to me. I've had a lot of fun drawing in a different and more challenging style, and interpreting these old models in new ways. Did you have a favourite? Make sure to comment down below. Join me next time where I draw some more of the mid-Sodor's extensive fleet of engines. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see it.